Hi, my name's Aaron. I am a localization architect at OnPurpose Studio. We help companies architect their code base for a global audience, and we train software engineers around internationalization best practices. One of the most common questions we get from engineering teams is really basically where to start. If you have a bunch of hard-coded English strings, how do you even start that? And how do you start bringing in your product and marketing teams to that process so they can start contributing, maybe eventually grow to have human translators or some kind of AI translation. But it all starts with the project. And so as you see here, I have just an empty Next.js boilerplate. Obviously, your code base is going to be more complicated than this, but the principles are the same. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use this as a jumping off point to demonstrate some of these principles. First up, I'm going to replace this Next.js landing page with just a simple hard-coded English text, and then we can get going. Okay, so as you see, I replaced a lot of the content and just entered a static English text. Our local is updated accordingly. And this is where many of you are probably starting. Obviously, your code is going to be way more complex than this. But whenever you decide it's time to start supporting translations, really the first step is deciding what library to use for that. Since I'm in a Next.js app, I'm going to choose NextJS-Intl, which is kind of the recommended framework. Really, you can use any one you want. If you look at it and it's popular and it's following the Unicode best practices, use it. Sounds great. This isn't going to be a detailed tutorial on integrating with any specific library. The principles really apply across the board. But since we're here, I know that my app is the app router. And then for this specific library, they support I18 and routing. If you have I18 and routing and want to essentially have your locale in your URL, you can do that. That's really an SEO decision, not really a technical decision. So in our case, we're going to do without I18 and routing, and I'm going to go through this setup process, the first step being installing the framework. Okay, that was easy enough. Now, what we need to do is we need to create our very first translation file. This is kind of the very first point of contact that an engineer is going to have, where your decision here could have some implications in your code base as you grow to support more languages, namely what locale you choose. So as you see in the documentation here, they recommend that you use en. I don't really recommend that. I recommend that in the code, whenever you're talking about file names, you should be seeing your locale as a slug, pretty much. So as some sort of ID that you don't want to change. So since I am an English speaker, this app is being authored in the United States. I am going to choose en underscore US as my locale. What this does is if my code grows to want to support multiple English dialects, I don't have to change anything. I can just start saying en underscore GB without really any kind of issues. And I can still have that same level of control. So if I want to support someone coming in with the en locale, I can make a mapping to my ENUS file, no problem, but it makes it much easier for me in the future as I grow. So I'm going to create my first translation file using the en underscore US locale. The format of this file really depends on what framework or library you're using. I'm going to just copy and paste from the documentation here. It looks like by default they are namespacing it with homepage, and I'm going to set my key as hi world, and I'm going to say hello translated world. Next up, we're going to want to create a integration with NextJS-Intl and Next.js, and I'm just going to follow the documentation here. Again, this video isn't intended to be a deep dive into any specific framework. This is pretty straightforward though. As you can see, I'm just importing this plugin and then I'm exporting it, wrapping the with Intl plugin. Feel free to check out the NextJS-Intl docs if you have any questions there. For now, we're going to make our next configuration file, which is this request file. Let's talk about this file for a second. Whenever you are ready to launch and go into production, you're going to want to be receiving this locale from your request header. Specifically, that comes in as the accept language header. And the value isn't a simple locale. It's not going to be EN or ES or ESUS. What it's going to be is a list of preferred languages. So it's going to be something that you are, if you were to do it from scratch, you're going to have to parse out. So a user is allowed to say, on my phone, I prefer the Spanish to be my priority language. And then if that's not available, I'll do English. And if that's not available, I'll do French. And so there are a ton of libraries out there that will do a locale matching of the locales you support versus the locales that are being requested in this accept language header. You're not going to have to do all that manually. When you're ready to launch, feel free to look into that. But for the sake of this demo, I'm going to just keep it hard-coded, and reminder, I'm using ENUS here. And also, I know from their documentation, my messages file aren't 2 directories up, they're 1 directory up. Now we're going to wrap our app in the provider. So I'm going to keep following the documentation here. Keep in mind that their documentation points out that you can inject your messages by default at this level. I don't typically recommend that, largely because this would get all of your messages and load that into your front end. So if you have a really large code base, that could be a lot of different keys. So I typically prefer to import the translation strings that I'm going to need at the level I'm going to need them. Finally, we have all this hooked together, and we can actually pull in the translation key that we want in our page or our page file. Reminder, we namespaced it as homepage. Okay, so we created our translation file using the en_us locale. We created our requests file. We are now using our provider. And so in theory, whenever we load up our local app, we should be seeing the translated content and not the static content. Do a reload. Cool, so hello translated world. All right, so that's one step down. We've integrated the framework. Now we want to talk about how to bring in the marketing and the product teams into this. So what I'm going to do is I am going to actually deploy this to Vercel just to make sure that in production the translation file is connected and everything's working as expected. Now I'm going to go over to Vercel. We should see this deployment come through. It's queued, so we'll wait for it to deploy and just make sure everything's working well so far. Now, if we visit our production site, we should be seeing our translated content. Hello, translated world. Cool. So again, even if you're just starting out your process of supporting translations, your flow will look similar to this, where you are slowly moving things into your source language translation file. In my case, that's ENUS. You don't have to have every language ready. You don't have to have translators in place. You don't have to have any of that. You can just begin building that habit. But now we want to begin having our product teams and our market teams involved in this process. And that's where a translation management system comes in. I use and have a relationship with Lokalise, so I recommend them. There's other providers as well, depending on your team's needs. Lokalise does have a free account. I already have it logged in and ready to go. And so I'm starting with a blank canvas as you see here. So I'm going to create my very first project, and it will be a web and mobile project. As you can see, they default to EN here. I, again, am choosing to be very specific with my locale, so I'm going to say ENUS. And for this site, I'm just going to be translating it into US Spanish. Completely empty project, no keys, in here, but this is where your product marketing content teams will be spending a lot of their time. And this is where you will want to have some kind of integration connect your repo to Lokalise so those teams can always know what the latest translations are that they can modify and issue translation requests for. So the best way to do that within Lokalise is using their GitHub app, which I'll integrate now. So my repository address is going to be from GitHub here. I'll paste that in. Up to you on what branch you want to use. Essentially, this is the branch that will receive a pull request from Lokalise with the latest translation files. So whatever makes sense for your team is what you would want to put in here. I'm going to use main, and this is for my web app, so I'll choose that. And I do typically include the full path in the file names. It just kind of helps simplify the process and make sure I'm not missing anything obvious as once I start dealing with more translation files, this makes it a little easier. So it read my repo, and I'm going to dig into messages and enus. So as your code base grows, enus, since that's what this app is being authored in, is going to sort of be the source of truth, so to speak, for the marketing teams and the product teams. All of the other feature languages you support can sort of be seen as a build artifact and won't need to be modified directly, and it will be generated automatically. So in this case, I'm just going to choose enus, and it does properly match that this is the English US over here. So now the GitHub app is integrated with my repo, but I want to automatically connect every time there's a push to this repo. I want Lokalise to automatically inject the latest translations, and then that way the marketing and product team can always be updated. So the best way to do that is use the webhooks, and so they include all of this information. So I'm going to integrate it now. Okay, webhook is good to go. So now whenever I do a push, in theory, it should automatically import into Lokalise. Now I want to point out pull options. I usually enable two specific things here. First is cleanup mode. I would recommend looking into the Lokalise documentation here, but essentially this removes any keys in Lokalise that don't exist in your translation file. You're going to find yourself as you are editing your code base day to day as it grows, you're going to be making new keys and stop using old keys. And so by enabling cleanup mode, it will keep your enus JSON file as the source of truth, and it will remove any keys that don't exist anymore in that file, up to you on if that's a good thing or not. And then I also enable automations. Lokalise has a way to perform various automations on anytime you detect translations changed. You can have it automatically have machine translation. You can apply AI translation. You can do pseudo localization, a lot of different stuff. So by enabling this one, you're basically just telling Lokalise to perform those automations whenever it detects changes there. So now that the pull options are set, I'm going to just manually pull the translations for now, but because of that webhook that I added, future keys will be automatically injected, but I'll go ahead and do this now. And as we go over to the editor, we should see those being pulled in. Cool. So as you can see, home page, hi world, and then this is directly from my enus translation file. Obviously, I don't have a Spanish translation file, so this is empty. I want to confirm that the webhook is working as expected, so I'm going to go back into my code and into my enus, and I'm going to make a new key and push it and just make sure that it gets pulled into Lokalise. So I've pushed to my repo. The webhook has connected to Lokalise, hopefully, and as you can see, view activity. So now the new key should show up. This is how your product and marketing teams are going to be able to keep updated on what the development team is up to without really having to worry about their workflow. As the developers do their normal process, all of these keys are going to be automatically injected into your Lokalise project. So Now let's talk about getting translation away out of Lokalise and into your repo. This is where your teams would either hire a translator, be using AI. There's a lot of pros and cons to those. But for this example, I'm going to just automatically do a Google Translate of each of these. And now me as someone on the product team says, okay, our translations are complete. We want to do another deploy to production and we want the developers to know about it. The best way to do that is to go to download. And this is something the dev teams might need to set up initially because there's a few technical aspects. Firstly, there might be instances where your product or marketing team makes a change to the ENUS file. So I know I've mentioned that the ENUS file is the source of truth, and that's correct. However, there will be changes coming in from Lokalise, and so you on the development team probably don't want to be in the business of having to manually edit this file. So I do recommend including that in the bundle that gets exported. And then we go to file structure, and this is where some development knowledge comes into play. Specifically, in our case, we want one file per language, and we want this file to end up in the exact same location as our repo. So if you recall, our repo has messages / enus, and so that's how we want it to land in our repo. And then finally, Lokalise kind of hides this away, but you're going to have to open up app triggers and you're going to have to click GitHub. What this will do is it will automatically make a PR to your project. If I were to click build and download here, what that would do is it would create the PR, which is what I want, but it would also just issue a download in my browser, which I don't really want. So I'm just going to click build only, and it's going to show me that there is a new translation pull request. And I'm going to go over to GitHub, and in theory, that should be showing up now. Cool. So go into that, and we will look at files changed. And as you see, we have our English file that's been changed. You can see they're not using the prettier configs I am, but nonetheless, the file is the same. That looks good. And then now we have this new ESUS file. And so this is essentially your marketing and product team saying, okay, we want to issue to production a deployment of the latest translations, and they clicked download, and then they automatically issued a PR through the Lokalise integration. And so the dev team can receive this pull request, and they can say, okay, well, it looks good, merge pull request, confirm merge. And now, depending on your setup, it is on its way to being deployed to production. This is a pretty simple example, but it really demonstrates the primary principles. You as the development team need to create your translation file, create some kind of integration. I use Lokalise that will automatically push up your translations into whatever your TMS provider is. That is where your product and your marketing teams will be making modifications to the content. They'll be requesting translations, and now they have a way to click a button and essentially make a PR into the repo. And then you on the development side will have the opportunity to say, okay, this does or doesn't make sense. You can make modifications and eventually deploy to production. So I hope this has been helpful to demonstrate some of these principles and create a full cycle of a translation pipeline. Please reach out to us at onpurpose.studio anytime you have questions. I'm always happy to help, and thanks for your time.